Welcome back, everyone. So today we're going to wrap up this Facebook access and security lecture, and then we'll break for a couple minutes and come back and we'll do the exam review at about 4 o'clock. So first of all, we're going to do a little overview of how things progress for Facebook. So quick rule of thumb, anything that's popular tends to draw a lot of bad guys, nefarious activity. Reason is most scams are impersonal numbers games, right? They're not trying to target a particular person. They're trying to go to where a lot of people are and get some fraction of that traffic. I'll also add this is a postulate, right? So a postulate is something that you can't exactly prove to be true, but it sounds reasonable and you're going to build a system of logic based on it, okay? So the postulate here is that the scramble to keep up with demand makes security less rigorous, right? So if you are a very popular site in the 21st century, like something like Facebook, well, chances are you're so focused on growth that security might take a little bit of a back seat for a while, right? Eventually, yeah, you'll come back and figure out the problems, but in that short term, while you're getting big, your focus is mostly on maintaining performance while you get big. Now, in fact, over the last decade, right over the last 15 years, there have been a lot of security issues on Facebook. Some of them against Facebook itself, some of them against its users. And you see them quite often, right? If there's like a link on Facebook, somebody posts an interesting article and it shows up in your feed and you click on it and it takes you to some site, some web page where all of a sudden, boom, you get all these security alerts and they're clearly trying to install some malware on your machine. Yeah, that still happens, right? So what's the trade-off? Well, Facebook wants to provide a safe and reasonably secure site while still remaining fast and convenient. So we talked the other day about how anytime you put in extra security barriers, it's going to slow down how the system works. It's going to make it more of a problem for users. And what Facebook wants to do is kind of have that balance where, yeah, there's going to be the occasional security problem, but in most cases, the overriding concern is keeping Facebook running fast and easy to use, because if Facebook loses that, then people are just going to go somewhere else. Okay. So, some things over the last 10 years. Now, the important thing to remember in terms of the exam, I'm not going to ask you details about these particular attacks, right? There's not going to be a question on the exam that says, what particular attack did Facebook face in 2011? Because to some extent, all of these attacks, are still ongoing. They certainly happened in multiple years. The point of them is to just give some concrete examples of security problems that Facebook has had. So all the different things we talked about, things like brute force attacks or various types of phishing. Yeah, those are all important things, but here are some concrete examples of how they're happening on Facebook. So the first one, malicious login attempts. So back in 2011, there was an article here, Facebook admits to 600,000 cyber attacks per day, right? And mostly that's people trying to fraudulently log into other people's accounts and otherwise steal people's access credentials and use them elsewhere. So one of the things that can often happen, I'm going to draw a little of this, just to give you an idea of what's going on. So your browser, right? Browser keeps some data about sessions, right? So basically, while you're connected to Facebook, you don't have to re-log in on every page, right? So basically, your browser is going to maintain these sort of access credentials. And basically, it's going to be some, big, complicated, encrypted string, some little slug of data, okay? And your browser stores that so you can go around to different pages without having to log in. Well, guess what? If there's some bad guy, so we'll draw bad guys over here. Bad guy. No, bad guy should be up here, right? Bad guy is the label. Okay, if the bad guy can somehow steal that session key, gets your session key, then what happens? The bad guy can log into Facebook just as if he were you, which means he could send out lots of instant messages directing people to various types of online scams or malware, etc. Okay, so once you get to one of those sites, if you end up getting some of that malware put on your machine, the bad guy may be able to use that to get your session key. And that's how, when you see that sort of thing on Facebook where like your grandma who never instant messages you sends out this really odd message trying to get you to visit this link, right? Say your grandma says, "Hey, I just learned about this cool new website. Come check it out." And she said, and you're like, that doesn't sound like the sort of thing grandma would send me. Yeah, she probably, went to a bad page and got some stuff, and the bad guys got her credentials, and they're using instant messages to try to propagate it. Okay, so that's a common kind of thing. Anyway, so one thing that Facebook basically said, well, one thing you should be more careful about clicking links on Facebook, right? Which, if you think about it, is a bit laughable, because the whole point on Facebook is something that shows up in your feed should be safe, right? If there's an article that appears in your feed, you would think it would be safe. How are you going to be, more careful about clicking on that? Facebook wants to put interesting stuff in your feed. They want you to click it so you can get to the article, so you can read it, so you can be happy about your time on Facebook. So the whole idea, be more careful when you click, yeah, that sounds nice, but it really doesn't mean anything. But the other thing, they created a new feature. So if your account gets locked for whatever reason, for example, it gets hacked or it gets involved in bad activity and Facebook says, you know what, you can't do this, you can't use it anymore for a while, or if the bad guys gain complete control of the account and they actually change the password on you, something like that, so they can send out a bunch of messages in the short term, yeah, you can designate a group of your buddies who can help you recover a locked account. So once upon a time, right, 10 years ago or so, if you got locked out of Facebook, what you actually had to do was something like get a picture of your driver's license, send it out to Facebook. They'd look at it, they'd verify that it was you, they'd call you up on the phone, you'd tell them some stuff about yourself, and then eventually you'd get let back in. But the problem is that whole operation is pretty expensive, right? They got to have people working the call centers, they got to have people verifying documents. It costs money to get people back into their accounts. And so Facebook really doesn't want to do that if they can avoid it, right? They want a nearly free automated method for doing it. So Facebook really likes the idea of having a group of trusted friends because they can automate that process, just send out some messages to your friends and say, is this person who he or she says she is? And then Facebook otherwise doesn't have to have their people get involved. Okay. 2012, social engineering attacks. So this is an article about some Chinese spies trying to get some sort of information about the admiral in charge of NATO at the time. So NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, right? Basically the North American and Western European alliance. So anyway, so they were trying to create things like fake profiles of the admiral or friends of the admiral so that they could communicate with other people and try to get information from him, right? Things like where he was traveling that might indicate things like military operations, or trying to do social engineering so they could maybe find out details about him that might be good in things like guessing pin numbers, or passwords, stuff like that. That's the sort of thing that they were trying to do. Or, eventually just pretend that they're the admiral himself and like talk to some people that, are actually involved in planning operations, and they could find out things that way. So Facebook, number one, basically crickets, right? They didn't have much to say about that because Facebook doesn't want to block people from creating new accounts. Even if those accounts are fake, sure. I mean, Facebook, if they can detect them, they will get rid of them. But other than that, right, Facebook doesn't want to put up a lot of hurdles, making it difficult for new users to create accounts, because that's what Facebook needs to make more money. But what they did do is they put in a feature that allows users to report fake accounts, and they did put in a little bit more effort into trying to detect accounts that were purporting to be various notable people, right? Whether they were, like this guy, like this admiral, or whoever else, anybody who's like a notable famous person. If you're going to try to be that sort of person, Facebook's going to ask for some kind of proof. Okay. 2013, interesting thing. So you had some Facebook employees working in a computer language called Java. So they had a problem, they needed to solve something. They went to basically a Q&A type site, try to figure out how to do something. And then in the process, they got some malware installed on their machine. So you have this article, Facebook admits it was hacked. So what happened, right, it was the guys who had the problem, they did the right thing. They immediately reported it. They were not, in fact, directly connected to Facebook at the time, so it wasn't like this malware got propagated through the Facebook system. What happened, eventually people recognized, oh, this is a serious vulnerability in Java. They issued a patch to fix it. Ironically enough, the Department of Homeland Security looked at that patch and found that the patch itself had a weakness in it. So yeah, they did a fix, but that fix itself had a vulnerability. Anyway, Facebook didn't have much to say about this since it really didn't affect its end users, but we can presume that they are operating with a higher level of Java security and telling employees, hey, be more careful when you go to outside sites, right? Don't remain connected to the Facebook system if you go to another site to try to figure stuff out. And of course, perhaps Facebook is trying to make more resources available internally so this sort of thing doesn't happen again. Okay. 2014. You see a lot of articles showing up in Facebook that are essentially scams or malware vectors, right? Basically ways for malware to propagate through the internet. Now, here's an interesting problem. Well, first of all, if you look at the top 10 scams, let's see if this is still active. There's some fun here. I do enjoy reading this article. So the first one is kind of hilarious. It's guess who viewed your profile, right? So number one, it doesn't actually work, right? There's no way you can go on Facebook. Facebook doesn't track who viewed your profile, and if they did, they're not going to make it available to you. But the reason, presumably, why people want to see this is because they think that anyone who views your profile is totally crazy in love with you and has a super crush, and you can somehow, I don't know, enjoy that or something. Anyway, but that's a very popular one. Other ones, naked videos of Facebook friends. Yeah, so that's what a lot of people do. And they say here, tricked more than 1,000 people into installing a malware, Trojan, that promised naked videos of their friends. There you go. Other stuff, just, horrible, shocking things. Woman dying during a fight, girl killed by husband scam, whatever. Okay, that sort of thing. That's what we see as far as these scams, right? But let's back to the slideshow. What they did, Facebook says, well, okay, yeah, a lot of these things on Facebook that are showing up in people's feeds are in fact directing them to bad problems, bad pages. So let's put this in paint. What happens is basically something like this. Step one, hackers hack a web server. Number two, they post up infected versions of web pages. Visitors see the web pages, which are on legitimate sites, and get infected, right? That's the idea. So what happens at first, so say here's some web server, right? Web server, okay, that's serving up web pages. And here is Facebook, right? So we have two things, actually. We're going to make an end user, and we're going to make Facebook in just a minute. Whoop, that's not what I wanted. Box. Okay, so here's an end user, and here's going to be, yeah, okay. Here's going to be Facebook. Okay, and this is going to be end user here, so ordinary user. And we'll get to how this process played out over time. So what would happen, the ordinary users, they would connect to the web server, they get the infected page, they get infected. Well, that's a problem. So eventually, Facebook jumped in. Facebook also started checking the web server. And if the Facebook guys got an infected page, they would block, right? So I'll draw a big, they would block access to the server, right? So they would say, oh, this page is infected. We're going to stop showing it in people's feeds. Okay, So that worked for a little while. But then what the web server guys did is this. They created two versions, right? So they had one infected version, okay, and another one, I do that, that was clean. And they figured out a way that they would look at the IP address of the visitor, right? So I'll do a, kind of some kind of IP check. They looked at who the visitor was. And if they said, this is an ordinary visitor, chances are they would direct it to the infected version. But if it were a Facebook checker, right, one of these security people, they would direct him to the clean version. Okay, and so then we get into this whole probabilistic thing where Facebook is trying to use a different pool of non-Facebook IP addresses, and the bad guys, they're not showing every ordinary user the infected one. They're trying to, they're trying to balance it out. Facebook says, well, we're not going to be able to check everything, but if we check more things, we'll have a better shot of catching them. So the bad guys, they're not going to give the infected copy to every user because they know that the population of ordinary users is a lot higher than the population of Facebook checkers. But the first Facebook checker that finds the infected one is going to get it shut down. So they got to figure out the optimal probability, how many users they can, attack. All right, so that's how that's going on over time. And the arms race is not ending anytime soon. Okay, what else? Couple more things. So they were doing state-sponsored attacks, right? If your account is attempted to be attacked by agents of a foreign government, Facebook will give you a notification about that. They'll identify if there's some malware on your machine, especially if it's something delivered through Facebook. 2016, this was one. Remember I said in a well-designed system, a brute force attack should not happen, but not all systems are well-designed. Well, in this particular article, what happened is that some Facebook engineers, they were retooling a feature and they created basically a duplicate entry point to the Facebook system. Now, ordinary Facebook, if you try to enter in your password a few times and it isn't correct, your account will get temporarily locked, right? You can fix it, but it'll get locked for a while. But on this backup entry point that the engineers made, it didn't have that lock-in feature. So a hacker who who found this thing out, essentially could have done a brute force attack, could have accessed Mr. Zuckerberg's account and updated his profile picture with whatever horrible thing he wanted. Anyway, but he didn't do that. He just told the good people at Facebook that, hey, there's this vulnerability on your site. Maybe you should fix it and tell your engineers to be more careful. So they gave him something, if I recall correctly from the article, something like £15,000 because it was in the UK, and then they fixed it. But it would have been a big deal if it had, been spotted by the wrong people. Okay, a few more minutes, then we're done. So attacker motivations. Most of your cyber groups these days are organized crime or governments, which to a certain extent, I suppose, are also organized crime. So things like military attacks, espionage groups, they're trying to sabotage things, criminal organizations typically just doing it for money. And then again, you have the occasional lone oddballs, right? People who have their own bizarre personal reasons for attacking a particular website. For example, there was the hack on Ashley Madison, the site which tried to hook up married people to other people they were not married to. There was a guy who hacked that and ended up releasing the entire list of Ashley Madison subscribers. He apparently was upset that his wife had cheated on him with someone through Ashley Madison, and thus, he felt it was his personal mission to bring the site down. So why do people launch attacks? Well, sometimes to steal information that's intrinsically valuable, right? So things like bank account, or if you're doing espionage, you want to figure out what the other side is doing. Yeah, you're going to steal some of their stuff. Figure that out. Blackmail, right? You can find out that somebody is doing something unsavory online and use that to blackmail them. Ransomware, right? That is a common thing. So basically you put in some malware that shuts down the system for a while unless they pay you, like $10,000 in Bitcoin. And there's been an increasing number of actually municipal governments that have been getting hit by this. Last year, maybe 2 years ago, the UK's National Health Service got hit by a big attack of ransomware. And, you know, a medical system like that, this is really serious because they have people that have, you know, fairly urgent surgeries going on. If the doctors lose access to treatment records, they have to go through paper stuff, and all that's going to be a lot slower and, you know, more inaccuracies. So there's that. Other things, influence policy or site operation. North Korea hacked Sony because they didn't want them to release that movie where they were trying to assassinate the North Korean dictator. And other things, personal motivations, that all reasons. So wide variety of motivations, but most of them, they're either, you know, government agents doing things against other governments, or they're criminals trying to steal money from people. Okay. Aggregate damage. Depending on what you consider to be the cost of security, there are three different measurements here. The first one, which is basically direct damage, so things like the money that's actually stolen from people, that comes out to maybe 10 billion or so a year. Another one that looks at all the costs, a broader spectrum of not only costs, direct costs, but also efforts to keep systems secure, came up with almost $500 billion. And another one that's from a cybersecurity operation, they try to go with the absolute high end of the estimates, and they're telling you it's about $3 trillion a year. But again, that includes all these direct costs and all the efforts that anyone worldwide is making to provide security. So when you see these numbers, you know, it's fair to be a little bit skeptical, consider motivations that people might have. So, you know, a CNBC article, I mean, it's hard to see how they have a big interest in overstating the numbers or understating them for that matter. But if you're selling security tools, sure, you want to go with the most alarming statistic possible. On the other hand, the first number, if you're an academic, right, you may have a very specific idea of what security costs are that don't necessarily line up with some of these other measures. So methodology differences. Methodology is a fancy word for how it gets done. So the definition of security cost is going to be different for that 10 billion figure than the other two. Okay. Organizational security. Number one, employees are the most common breach point, right? Basically, employees do something that breaks security. So how do you fix that? Number one, give regular training. First, when an employee gets hired, and second, regular refreshes on that. And number two, have clear policies, especially for mobile devices, because mobile devices have extra problems because they can be easily physically removed from the premises. Desktops, not so much. Monitor system activity, right? So number one, establish baseline history of what an employee's activity should look like. For example, what times of day they're involved in the operation, if they're going on vacation, things like that. A lot of these attacks that happen through compromised user accounts, they wait for when the user is going to go on vacation for a couple weeks and won't be checking their email or other things. If the system knows that, it'll know that, oh gosh, it was really suspicious that you logged in at 4 in the morning, you know, when you should have been on vacation. Why would you do that? Let's look a little deeper. And then periodic risk assessments, right? So every now and then do test scenarios for security failures or other problems. Have contingency plans already in place. What do you do if something goes wrong? And when you have somebody audit your operation for security, use neutral outside auditors, right? Don't just rely on your own people who might say, you know what, everything's good, we're not too worried, because if they do say something is bad, it might make themselves look bad, or it might entail a lot of extra work for them. People have motivations to maybe not be as thorough as somebody from the outside. Okay. For individuals, what can you do? Number one, don't install unauthorized software, right? This is a very common thing. People install some app, the app has vulnerabilities, they shouldn't have installed it in the first place. Number two, strong passwords, regularly updated. Antivirus tools, keep those active, don't shut them down. One of the things that people might do is if they're in crunch time, they might say, gosh, this antivirus software is making everything I do slower, I'm going to turn it off for a while. Well, that could potentially be a very big mistake. Security updates. One of the things we often see is that when security updates happen, they're not installed immediately. So typically, an organization will get these large batches of security updates for all of its applications, and it'll maybe schedule one night during a week to install them on all the computers. So what can happen is in most of these security attacks, people find that the patch that would have prevented the attack was actually available, it just hadn't been installed yet, right? Or what can also happen, the patch can be available to all the different departments of a business, but because they're on different update schedules, it's been installed on some machines in the department, but not all of them. So yeah, ideally, you install these security updates pretty quickly once you get them. As an individual, be alert to suspicious emails. If you see an email that sounds fishy, doesn't make sense, give it a closer look. If you're worried about it, forward concerns to your security contact, and of course, regularly back up important documents, right? That'll lessen the impact of any ransomware. So for example, imagine if you were a PhD student working on your dissertation and you had like 200 pages and years of effort, but you, like a fool, only had one copy of it or one current copy on your machine, and then you got hit by ransomware. Well, you might have a philosophical objection to paying, but if you don't pay, you're probably never getting that work back. So yeah, you probably go ahead and pay. But you wouldn't have to if you'd updated it, if you'd uploaded a recent copy to Google Docs at the end of the day. All right, so that's what I have to say about that. We're right at the time to end this. So I'm going to say we are going to forward these concerns to the review session. I'm going to stop this application now. I'm going to stop recording, and we're going to resume immediately with the other session for exam review.